did agree to myself. Welcome, everybody. How's everyone doing tonight? Welcome back to our first meeting of the fall, end of the year. So I'm Mark Nolan, Wichita Audubon Vice President and Program Coordinator. Just wanted to tell you a couple things about the programs we have coming up in October and later this month. At the Chaplain Nature Center on September 28th, you can join us for monarch butterfly tagging at 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., led by our Chaplain Nature Center Director and Naturalist Liz Walker. Of course, we have our second Saturday bird walks every month here at the Great Plains Nature Center. So the next one of those is coming up October 12th, Saturday at 8 a.m. So it's always second Saturday every month, 8 a.m. Meet out there in the parking lot. It's a great time to see the returning sparrows and all the migrant winter birds coming back for the winter at that time of October. And then our meeting, October 15th, our general meeting, will be Ann Heitman talking about her work at the Sedgwick County Zoo. She's the curator of birds at the Sedgwick County Zoo, and they've been doing a lot of work with the conservation of endemic forest birds in Pacific Islands and the Marianas Islands. So the Guam kingfisher, if you know anything about that, at the Sedgwick County Zoo. And then I'll be leading a field trip on October 19th to Kingman State Fishing Lake to look for newly arrived fall migrants like sparrows and ducks. So for that and more, you can take a look at our website for the full schedule of all the events and field trips that are coming up. And I've recently learned also, if you get the email newsletter, if you look at the top right-hand side of the newsletter, there's a link that you can print out the full thing. And so it'll have more than just the newsletter. It prints out the full 2-page schedule of events. Since we don't print these out to hand out, you can just print it out right there and see all those. All right. So tonight, not talking about birds, but talking about a topic that'll hopefully be interesting to everyone who's curious about wildlife in Wichita. Tonight we have Jon Beckmann. He's currently wildlife supervisor for Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks and an adjunct graduate faculty member at Utah State University. Jon completed his PhD at the University of Nevada, where he focused his dissertation work on comparing black bears at the wildland-urban interface to wildland bears. Jon's research is focused also on impacts of natural gas development and other anthropogenic factors on ungulate migrations in the northern Rockies. Sometimes we have ungulates moving through Wichita. You've heard about that elk recently. Jon also has 25 plus years of an ongoing study investigating impacts of urban environments on black bears. His work over the past 25 years led to the return of black bears to the Great Basin Desert following an 80-year absence, and that population now totals greater than 700 bears. He's spent the past 25 years examining habitat connectivity for large carnivores in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and for jaguars and other species along the U.S.-Mexico border. And along with 70-plus peer-reviewed journal publications and 9 book chapters, he's the lead editor on a book entitled Safe Passages, Highways, Wildlife, and Habitat Connectivity. So tonight he's going to talk about urban foxes and coyotes in Wichita and their ongoing project. Welcome, Jon Beckmann.
Thank you, Mark, for that kind introduction. That'll save me several slides. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is a new project that we have going on here in Wichita on our urban coyotes and foxes. And tonight you'll hear me use the term canid. That's just the term for the dog family, and so I'm just referring to coyotes and foxes when I say that. And so it's a little dangerous because you have a carnivore ecologist stand in front of an Audubon society. And the more dangerous part than the carnivore side is the scientist side. But I promise I won't snow you with a lot of figures and tables. But there will be 3 slides tonight that we'll all work through together that are a little data rich, but that's what you get when you put a scientist in front of you. As Mark said, my background is mostly on large carnivores. I've worked on everything from mountain lions to black bears and grizzly bears and wolverines, but I've also done a lot of work on ungulates and different species across North America. But tonight what I want to focus on are four kind of themes or goals. The first I want to talk about is urbanization and what that means for canid management. A lot of these issues are not just specific to coyotes and red foxes, but to a lot of the different species that are living on the landscape that we are having a greater and greater impact on as the human footprint increases across the landscape. Then I'll talk about the history of coyotes and red fox in the state of Kansas, knowing that they have two different histories, and that will become important in some of the management decisions. And then I'll talk a little bit about the data collection and how we're going about understanding our urban coyote and red fox population here in Wichita. We're collecting data in three different ways. We're using GPS radio collars on individuals. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that tonight because, again, we're 1 year into this project and we're just starting to get those collars out now. But I will focus mostly tonight on the two other methods of data collection. That's the camera traps that we're using in Wichita and the citizen science reporting project that we have as part of this larger project. And then I'll talk a little bit about results because that's why we're all here tonight, to hear something about animals. So before I get started, I want to acknowledge my co-principal investigators on this project. First, Neville Terraparevla. Neville is a graduate student at Utah State University under the direction of Julie Young and myself at USU. Julie is a good friend of mine. She is an associate professor. She and I have worked on multiple species together, including species like jaguars and also pronghorn and other systems. And then I also want to really acknowledge Charlie Cope. Many of you, probably most of you know Charlie. He is the district wildlife biologist for the Department of Wildlife and Parks that covers Sedgwick County, including Wichita, and then a couple adjacent counties. So let's talk about the issues around urbanization and canid management. The biggest thing is that urban expansion is accelerating not only in the United States but globally. And you can see this in this right-hand image where the human footprint is really demonstrated, particularly in the eastern part of North America. And here in Wichita, we're kind of right, like we are in many things ecologically, on that boundary line between extreme urbanization on the eastern half of the United States and the more open areas with the Intermountain West and the western part of the United States. We are now at our point in our history where more than half of the world's human population lives in cities. And what I'm going to define as a city tonight, and in that statement, is any area greater than 50,000 people. And this includes more than 70% of Americans live in urban centers. And here in Kansas, we're a little below that average. We're about 57% of our population lives in urban centers. And this is shown by this map, oops, I'll go back, here on the left. And what you can see is that any county that's in purple or lavender is a county that was at its largest population in the most recent census or the one preceding it. And these data are a little dated. This is the 2010 census, but the same pattern occurs here in the 2020 census. The counties in green in Kansas are counties that had their largest human population sometime in the past. And for most of these counties in Kansas, that was generally between 1890 and 1940. And so what this map shows is what we refer to as rural flight, where people are moving to the urban centers out of rural areas because they're going where there's more jobs and tend to be the higher paying jobs. And so this is a phenomenon that's happening not only here in Kansas, but across the globe. The other thing is that with this shift of people in these urban areas, there's also a shift in their attitudes towards wildlife. And this is related to two factors, not only urbanization, but also with an increasing education level. And so if you look historically here on the right, most people fell along what we would call traditionalist in their view towards wildlife, where wildlife was viewed as a resource that should be managed. And in these graphs, these are all 50 states. Kansas, I know it's kind of hard to see, is always in the red box. So we're, again, right in the middle like we are in a lot of things. But as people have shifted to urban areas, they've taken on more of this mutualist view of wildlife. And this is kind of a worldview where wildlife are seen as part of a social circle, and they are species to be lived with in harmony. And that is increasing over time. And so as wildlife managers, that's something that we are constantly contending with and dealing with because people's attitudes change, and we're always trying to deal with multiple publics out there that see wildlife very differently. I just like to throw this slide in here because I love this photo. Urbanization is increasing. This is a bison herd and a photograph by Hans Watson outside of Denver, Colorado. So there's many examples of anthropogenic or human factors that influence the behavior and the distribution and the population, what we call dynamics of wildlife species. Some of these will be more familiar to us than others, but things like human structures, so buildings and parking lots. This is a Mexican free-tailed bat in McCarran International Airport, Las Vegas, in the parking garage. It's a very large roosting colony of Mexican free-tailed bats there. Things like fences. Some small fences like barbed wire fences or woven wire can have impact, but obviously border walls and border fences can impact wildlife. And I worked on the U.S.-Mexico border and wildlife connectivity issues down there for many years. And obviously that's the one that we're most familiar with, but if you look at the number of border walls going up across the world, I think right now, there's 84, 85 border walls between countries going up across the globe. Recreation has an impact on distribution of animals. This is a photo I took of snowmobilers and influencing bison in Yellowstone National Park in the winter. We tend to think of motorized recreation as having a large impact on wildlife behavior and distribution, things like ATVs or motorcycles or snowmobiles. But it's really interesting when you look at the data. In many cases, and for different wildlife species, the larger impacts from recreation come from what we would consider lower impact. People walking, especially if they have a dog off the leash, people mountain biking. Those kind of things have a really big impact depending on where they're at on wildlife behavior and distribution. So one example of this are bighorn sheep. Mountain biking has a very large impact on the distribution behavior of bighorn sheep in the Rocky Mountains. And then, of course, novel foods and novel water resources can have a distribution impact on these species. So as wildlife ecologists, one of the things that we're really interested in is conserving what we call ecological function. In many cases, we have animals out on the landscape, so numerically they're there, but they may not be doing what they historically done. And so this comes from some of the work I've done on bears in urban areas in the past, where we have bears in these urban areas out in the west. And when they're feeding on nothing but garbage or barbecue grills or pet food, they're there on the landscape, but they're not doing what bears historically did. They're not eating plants and seeds and being dispersers of seeds. They're not cycling energy or nutrients through the system. They're not being predators on their prey items like neonatal or fawns or things like elk or deer. And so this can have impacts that are similar to the absence of those animals. The animals are there, but they're not doing what they did in those wild systems. So what's some evidence that anthropogenic or human food resources can influence, in this case, carnivore distributions, because we're eventually going to be talking about our carnivores here in Wichita. Well, there's some really good data from some national parks, and those of you that have seen me talk about bears have probably seen this cartoon here. The bear says, "I don't care if you're a member of the Sierra Club, Sequoia Club, or Daniel Boone himself, fork over the Oreos." And this cartoon actually has its basis in reality. So these are what were known as the mugging bears of Yosemite National Park. Back in the 80s and 90s, the National Park Service used to tell visitors in Yosemite National Park in California that if they saw a bear on the trail, just to drop their backpack and leave, and they wouldn't have any issues with the bears. Well, it didn't take the bears long to figure out, hey, if I just hang out alongside the edge of the trail and a hiker comes along, I just have to step out in front of a hiker, they'll set down their backpack and free meal for me. And so these bears became known as the mugging bears of Yosemite. There's also examples in systems I've worked in Yellowstone with grizzly bears at the dumps. Those of us that are old enough to remember, they used to have open dumps in Yellowstone National Park where you could go and sit on bleachers, and it was the only way really to see grizzly bears because the numbers had declined to only about 110 to 120 bears in the park. And so what they figured out, biologists were like, this isn't really good for the bears, and so they closed the dumps. And what happened was initially there was a spike in mortality of bears that just couldn't quit garbage cold turkey. But in the absence of dumps, what happened was the bears then redistributed across the Yellowstone ecosystem and started doing what bears do and restoring that ecological function. So they became predators on their prey items. They started cycling energy and nutrients, dispersing of seeds, pine nuts, for example, that they spend a lot of time in the fall eating. Now, what happens for us as wildlife managers is that oftentimes when we're dealing with these carnivores, there's always a lot of challenges because people see them very differently. And so the management decisions we make have to include these various choices, and we have to make them based on data. And when we work in an absence of data, that puts us in a more challenging position as wildlife managers because our trade-offs for decisions have to become acceptable across these different publics out there. So, as we move along in the story tonight, it's not just large carnivores that can occur in these urban areas, but it's also these meso, or what we would call medium-sized carnivores that can be impacted by urban expansion and these associated resources. So what I'm going to focus on tonight are obviously coyotes and red fox, this picture from Wichita, but this pattern can really have impacts on other species like skunks and raccoons, and bobcats and other mesocarnivores that inhabit places like Wichita as well. And I just like some of these photographs of the raccoons hanging out on the side of chimneys and ladders. So I'm not going to read this long text to you except just to read the last sentence. This is from a paper that was published in 2020 in the Journal of Urban Affairs. And it says, in cities where coyotes have become established more recently, the timing of their arrival has overlapped with an ongoing reevaluation in science and in society of the role of wild animals in urban settings. As part of this reevaluation, conservation scientists, and I would add managers and researchers, are de-emphasizing human-wildlife conflict in favor of tolerance and coexistence. And so that's kind of a movement that we're seeing across the United States and the globe. But one thing I will say is that as we talk about coyotes, they're starting to expand into areas that they haven't been historically, both in urban areas and in different parts of North America. Historically, coyotes did not occur much in the eastern half of the U.S., but in the absence of wolves, for the last 100 to 200 years, coyotes have started to expand the range into places like upstate New York, New Jersey, places they historically were not there. Even though we're trying to look at some of this tolerance and coexistence levels and those ideas, there's still a lot of conflict between people and these canids. And this is just an example of the newspaper articles from the last couple of years of people having conflicts with coyotes or red fox across the U.S. And this is just a very small sampling of the kind of stories that we see. And they range from everything of coyotes or foxes attacking pets to, in some cases, animals that tested positive for rabies actually attacking people. And so this is, while it's still rare, it's an increasing issue that we're dealing with, and you'll see we're dealing with it more and more here in Wichita. And I'll just give a couple of examples. In April of last year, a lady and her Doberman were chased by 5 to 6 coyotes in Chapin Park in southeast Wichita. She had the Doberman off the leash. The Doberman came back over the hill, really hauling the nail, and behind the dog were 5 or 6 coyotes. She jumped in the car, closed the door. The dog and her were safe, but there were 5 or 6 coyotes around there, and there were several witnesses when we went to investigate this. Earlier this year, we had a coyote that grabbed a dog while a man and his son-in-law were walking the dog in southeast Wichita. And so we're starting to see these types of issues. And this makes management of these urban canids challenging for us as wildlife managers. This is just the number of direct conflicts or interactions with coyotes by age in the city of Wichita. These are direct conflicts. These are not all the calls that poor Charlie gets about all these species, but you can see it's an increasing trend. There's variation from year to year, but the trend line is increasing over time. So one of the things that scientists have started to do in response to this in a lot of these urban areas is start to engage the public through citizen science, where people can report the sightings or interactions with these types of species. And this has particularly been the case for coyotes. And so we've seen these citizen science projects pop up in places like Portland, Oregon, Madison, Wisconsin, Vancouver, British Columbia, Washington, D.C. But nobody's really ever analyzed those data to say, are the citizen science data similar or very different than the types of data we get from these more traditional methods of things like radio collars or camera traps. So that's one of the things we're trying to do, and I'll get into that in a bit. But I wanted to set the stage a little bit more with the history of coyotes and red fox in the state of Kansas. First, let's talk about coyotes. Coyotes in Kansas are not legally classified as fur bearers, but in many ways, our agency, we monitor and manage them as if they were. You've got to have a fur harvester license to trap them, a hunting license required to hunt them, but they really are managed as non-game that can be hunted. And this is a result of the historic attitudes and the potential of conflict with the livestock industry. So they're not afforded the protection of a harvest season like our other fur bearers in the state. And coyotes are native to Kansas. In contrast, our red fox are not native to the state of Kansas. In fact, almost all of the foxes in the lower 48 are descendants of European foxes that were released for sport hunting in the 17 and 1800s. There were some historical red fox populations in the boreal areas in extreme northern North America, but all of the foxes that we have in places like Kansas are non-native. And so one of the things is that we don't have a lot of data on our foxes, but we do know that the typical habitat tends to be these croplands that are interspersed with woodlots. And I highlight this off our website in red here. It says, but the majority of red foxes in Kansas inhabit the suburban fringes of towns and cities, which offer refuge from coyotes. So coyotes and red fox compete against each other, and coyotes will actually kill red fox. But keep in mind this concept of foxes inhabiting the suburban fringes, because we'll come back to that here in a second. So let's talk about how we're going about understanding our foxes and coyote populations in Wichita. We really have three objectives in this study. First, we want to determine the distribution of space use of coyotes and red fox in Wichita. Second, we want to collect data using citizen science to compare with these traditional methods of radio collars and camera traps to see if we can use citizen science to help us understand these populations. And then we're also trying to look at how removals are impacting space use, densities, distribution, and conflict levels. And these removals aren't always management removals. They could be something like a wildlife vehicle collision where an individual is just hit by a car. So I'm not going to go into this, but we have three different ways, again, that we're collecting data. Over time, this is a long-term project. We'll start to get at things like home range size and diets, production of kits and pups over time, those kind of things. But tonight, I'm just going to talk about some of their distribution. Hopefully, we're all familiar with the study area, but I'll go ahead and walk us through. We obviously all found Wichita on the map because we're all here tonight. But here's how we define our Wichita study area. Basically, within this rectangle, give you a little bit more information about the city here. This area in the box that you see here covers 603 square kilometers, which is 233 square miles. There's 395,000 people as of the latest census for Wichita that live in that box. In terms of our city parks areas, we have 4.7% of the city area is covered in parkland. That's below the national average. The median for the United States is 8.2% of the land being parkland across the U.S. Of that, 55% of our parkland is designed. That means it's either parks, golf courses, and or including cemeteries. And so the remaining 45% of our parkland is considered natural areas. So again, I'm not going to talk much about the GPS collar aspect tonight, but we are in the process of trying to capture 15 to 20 coyotes and 15 to 20 red fox to get movement data. These are GPS collars that give us real-time location information so we can see the movement of fox and coyotes across the city. In terms of our camera traps, we are using these Browning Strike Force Pro cameras that will hold up to 10,000 photos. And we have them, for obvious reasons, in a lockbox to keep them from being stolen and also damaged by people out there if you happen to see our cameras out there on the landscape. So how are we going about setting these cameras across the city? Well, we've gridded off the entire city in these 3-kilometer grid cells that are hexagon in shape. That's just so, that's a very standard design. And then we've randomly placed, using computer programs, a camera trap location within each of those grid cells. So this leads to 67 cameras across the city of Wichita at any one time. And these are just the actual locations of the cameras right now. And you can see Michaela, one of our technicians, putting cameras out there on the landscape. We are using a camera trapping plan, so they're discrete sessions. They're 5 weeks at a time during spring, summer, fall, and winter. And we are using artificial intelligence to process our photos. We're using 2 programs, Mega Detector and Time Lapse. And we have to use artificial intelligence because, just to give you an idea of the number of photographs, in the first year of the study, we generated 1.52 million photos. So we couldn't physically sit there and look at every photograph and say, yep, that's a bird, yep, that's a fox, yep, etc. So we set the sensitivity of the AI at greater than 20% probability. If AI determined that had a greater than or equal to 20% probability of being an animal, then we're going to look at that photo. We set that in retrospect. We wanted to be conservative because we didn't want to miss photos, but in future years we'll probably bump that up because we're looking at an awful lot of 2-liter pop bottles with moonlight reflecting off of it, where AI thinks it might be the reflection of an eye of an animal. So, you know, I'm tired of looking at Pepsi and Coke bottles out there on the landscape. So we'll change that as we get more information. Once we randomly locate a camera trap location to put the camera, we then buffered it with 300 meters just to give us some wiggle room, and this is pretty common in camera trap studies. And the reason we do this is shown here on these 2 slides. This point here fell right in one of the sand pits. We're obviously not going to go put a couple $100 camera right in the middle of the water. And then this one fell right on 235. Again, we're not going to put our camera out on a 4-lane divided highway, and so that just gives us some play to put the camera in a place that makes sense. Now, in terms of the citizen science aspect of this, what we did is we developed a web page on the KDWP website for the project. And if you just use any search engine, you could be using Google or whatever, Firefox. If you type in Wichita Urban Coyote, Wichita Urban Red Fox, Wichita Coyote, Wichita Red Fox, whatever, it'll be the first thing that comes up. And this allows you to report a sighting of an animal. You can find out information about our study, and there's links about how to get involved. If you're interested in maybe having a camera on your property, you can contact us. You can learn more about the animals, more about the study team, and eventually we'll put a map of the sightings up on that website, but when we'll do that is to be determined. And this is just an example of the type of photos we're getting turned into us. This is a red fox that's obviously sitting on the roof of a car outside of a bank on Kellogg on the east side of town. We didn't reinvent the wheel for our website. We used the Portland Urban Coyote Project and people that we know out there to build a similar model, partly so we can compare results across some of these different urban areas over time. So this is what the website looks like if you go to report a sighting. And it just allows you to say what you saw, when, where, what habitat, how many, and then there's a place to upload pictures or video. So for example, if you get on a Ring doorbell, you can upload a video. This is what, when you're filling out the survey, it's obviously 100% voluntary. You don't have to identify yourself. You can if you would like to be contacted by the research team, but it can be done, you know, anonymously. And when you get there, you'll see this map, and you can move that cursor anywhere in the city that you find the animal. You just drop the cursor right there, and it'll give us a GPS location of where the sighting was. And again, you can enter all kinds of different information. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight, but we are asking some kind of human dimension questions, like seeing this animal made me feel, and then there's some selections and then a box you can put in there. And there's several of those types of questions. Again, it's all voluntary. You don't have to answer all of the questions. But I will come back to that particular question here later. And then, like I said, you can upload pictures or videos. We do have a project-specific email address that is also on the site if a video or a photo is too large for the system to handle. And we've had many people upload videos and photos for us. So we have advertised this site, this study in many ways. The first is that we created these flyers that have a QR code on it. So you'll see these flyers in city and county government buildings, state government buildings. We have them in different parks and throughout the city. And if you see one of those, you can just point your phone at it and it'll take you directly, that QR code will take you directly to the recording site. We've done this in multiple languages, including English and Spanish. So we hit different communities within Wichita. And we've also done targeted traditional media releases, so using newspapers and television. And we've done social media releases at the same time, so things like Facebook, Instagram. You may have seen our project on Instagram. And the media is only covering the citizen science aspect of the study. Okay, so let's get to some of the results. Let's see what we're finding out about our urban coyote and red fox population. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the data that we've gotten from the cameras. Okay, so these are the 67 camera locations across the city in this first year. And what we've seen, so if a camera detected a coyote, it's shaded in black. If it detected a red fox, shaded in red. If it got both of them, it's hatched, it's both of them. And then if it's detected neither a coyote or a red fox, it's not shaded at all. And so at this point, what I just want you to see is the macro perspective, and we'll delve down into more specifics. But if you look at this, remember what our website said. It said that red foxes inhabited the fringes of towns as protection from coyotes. What do you notice by circling here? It's pretty red, right? A lot of red foxes from the cameras. Whereas if I make a line on the periphery, we see a lot more of the black, so we're detecting a lot more coyotes on the periphery. And so that's the macro thing we're seeing from the camera trap data, and you'll see from the citizen science data some similarities and some differences. So just to summarize, again, the cameras that were set out for 5 weeks at a time the first year and through 4 seasons. In year 1, we captured 780 pictures of coyotes and 631 pictures of red foxes from the 67 cameras. And this is over what we call a trap night. So we had 8,190 trap nights. So a single trap night is if you have a camera out for one night, that's one trap night. If we have all 67 cameras out for one night, we have 67 trap nights. So it's a big effort for us to have 8,000 trap nights out there. And again, in the first year, we had 1.5 million photographs, and we're well over 2 million photographs at this point. I'm not going to go into the statistics here, but the average occupancy of sites by coyotes and red fox in Wichita was 0.38 for coyotes and 0.32 for red fox. So, okay, now this is where everybody I might lose you, but I'll try not to. So don't gloss over on me, but if you want to take a nap, that's fine too. Not going to hurt my feelings, but again, you put a scientist in front of you. So there's a little bit of data here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, so coyotes are these top 3 panels. Foxes are the bottom 3 panels. Here is distance to roads, the relationship between 2 species with building density, and the relationship of the camera detections relative to average income in a neighborhood. So I'm just going to summarize this. You can look at the photos if you want, or you can just listen to me. Occupancy was significantly and negatively correlated with building density for coyotes. So as building density went up, the number of coyotes went down. So if you get towards the end of city core, we have fewer coyotes. But it's positively correlated with building density and red fox density, so it's just the opposite. The average probability of detecting a coyote was 0.36, but the average probability of detecting a red fox was only 0.17. So we're detecting red fox at a lower level. This probably is due to the fact that we made that grid cell size 3 kilometers. We probably need to shrink it a little bit to have a higher probability of detecting red fox because they're just not moving around at the level we thought they might be. Camera placement, so wherever that camera was, the number of days I was out, and season had no effect on detection probability of coyotes. And we saw the same pattern for red fox, but we were more likely to detect red fox in fall. compared to the spring, summer, and winter. And the reason for this is that's when red fox kits are dispersing. So when the young are leaving their natal den, the place they were born, they're going to range further in the fall. And so we tend to catch the red fox because they start to have a large enough home range that we start to catch them more often with their cameras. Okay, this is the second data slide, and I'll try not to snow you with this. This is activity patterns. So we have cameras, see the little camera here in panel A, and the citizen science data here in panel B. This is a 24-hour cycle. So we start at noon, go to 6 p.m., we go to midnight, 6 a.m., and then noon again. What you can see here is red fox are in red, coyotes are in blue, and people's activities are the black line. So I'll just read this for you. But coyotes were most likely to be detected by cameras during the night, between 9 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning. But most of the detections were at 1 in the morning. Okay? So look at coyotes in blue. Most of our detections are right around 1 o'clock in the morning. Red foxes were also most likely to be detected by cameras at night between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m., but they have two primary activity peaks at 4 a.m. and 11 o'clock at night. So our coyotes and foxes from the cameras, they're out at nighttime. However, when people are detecting them, tends to be what we call crepuscular periods, so evening and morning. So people are most likely detecting coyotes and foxes around sunrise and sunset, with a peak around 9 o'clock at night and 7 o'clock at morning. And that tells us that people are most active, especially in the summertime at those periods when they get home from work, they're out walking, jogging, whatever, doing activity. But it's not necessarily when these species are the most active, it's just when there's the most overlap. Because the camera data tells us that the animals are really active more in the heart of the night in the city. Okay, not surprisingly, I guess I'll just point this out. Humans were most active not at midnight, but at noon, and then during the daytime. So let's now shift from cameras, and we've kind of talked a little bit about sighting data there, but let's talk about the citizen science aspect of this. And I will say one thing, we are grateful and very thankful for the citizens of the city of Wichita. They have been really engaged in this project. There's a lot of these projects across the country that are doing good to have 500 to 1,000 locations over several years, and you'll see we're in a lot different situation. In fact, following the press release in March of 2003 when we first started the project, within the first week we had 170 locations turned in by citizens in the city of Wichita. Within 3 weeks, we had 400 locations. So from 20th of March to 7th of April last year, we had 400 locations of foxes and coyotes turned in, and a lot of these have pictures or videos with them. So now let's jump forward basically almost a year into the project. So as of 31 January of this year, we had 2,000 citizen science reports of foxes and coyotes across the city. And so of those, coyotes, which are in purple, we have 527 reports that we could verify, and red fox, we had 1,143 red fox reports turned in by citizens of Wichita. And so again, take this macro picture. There are some differences that we'll talk about here, but the macro picture, if I circle the kind of the core of the city, is it mostly orange or purple? Mostly orange, right? So mostly red fox. And again, on the periphery, if we go around the periphery, we start to see more coyotes than we do in the urban core. That doesn't mean there's not coyotes in there. Both our cameras and people have seen coyotes down in the urban core, but they're just not as common. And so one of the questions we want to know is, are these coyotes on the edge, are they transients that tend to move between rural areas and just are popping up in the city every once in a while? Or are they tending to stick in the city and be truly urban canines? And that's something that we hope to get at through the radio collar aspect of the study. I'll just update you, as of 31st of May this year, we were at 2,400 reports by citizens, and I just looked the other day and we're almost at 2,700 reports. So we're very thankful that we're getting this data to compare with the other methods. Okay, my last really data intensive slide, but again, you don't have to look at the graphs, you can just listen to me. if you don't like the science and the numbers. But again, coyotes on the top, foxes on the bottom, distance to road, building density, and income of the areas that the reports were from. And so now we're just talking the citizen science data. Both coyotes and red fox were more likely to be sighted closer to roads. That's not surprising by people because we drive a lot of roads, and that's when you cover a lot of ground, you tend to see coyotes and red fox. But we saw no relationship to distance to roads with our cameras. Coyote and red fox sightings were also both more likely in areas with a higher mean annual household income when we look at citizen science. We didn't see that pattern. It was not significant with camera data. So this is something that might be a bias when you use citizen science data. Not surprisingly, and most likely, people with higher annual household income may have more time or resources to report on the website, and so we see that become a significant factor. Both species were also most likely to be sighted at intermediate building densities. Remember when we looked at the camera data, it was a positive relationship with red fox and building density and a negative relationship for coyotes. But in terms of reporting from citizens, they both had the same pattern. And this is probably when people tend to be active. It's closer to their homes and not down in some of these industrial areas or downtown where we have higher building densities. So let's talk about our sightings across the time of the year. And this again is just the citizen science data. Most people are reporting seeing coyotes or foxes in April and then another peak in October. And this probably is a reflection of what's really going on with the biology of these species. In April, the females are raising pups, so they're moving around a lot because they're having to feed those pups, so they're out hunting a lot. And so there's a higher probability of detection. And then in October, again, we see the dispersal of the kits or the pups away from the den that they were born in. And so that's probably what's leading to that spike in October reports. When we look at time of day, we've already seen these data, but most people are seeing coyotes and red fox about 6 o'clock in the morning, and then again at 9 o'clock at night. Those are the two peaks when people tend to see these two species out on landscape in Wichita. When we look at the number of individuals in a sighting, this is a nice photo from Wichita. You can see the two foxes hanging out on their roof. You always wonder how they get up on a roof, but you know, they're good climbers. If you've ever seen them go up a fence, it's not that surprising. The vast majority of our sightings, almost 80%, saw a single individual, but 21% of our sightings that people are turning in saw at least two, if not more, individuals. Okay, let's look, the only bit of human dimension data I'm going to look at tonight. I'm not a human dimensions person or a sociologist, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn one time. So I don't know if that makes me qualified to talk about this or not, but I'm going to give it a shot. So when we ask people how they felt about seeing an animal, this is the red fox data. So look, I want you to really focus on these four columns. Happy, lucky, scared, worried. When people see red foxes, the vast majority, 83% of them, feel happy or lucky. Very few people are scared or worried. Okay? Remember that. Because now the next one, coyotes. Totally different perspective. People aren't so happy or lucky in their feelings when they see a coyote. We see a lot more people being scared and a lot more people being worried. Some of this is historical inertia with coyotes. Some of it's real and perceived conflicts over time historically with livestock, and even though they're not wolves, we see the same kind of outcome with wolves. It's kind of they're lumped together as the big bad canid out there. One of the things that's really interesting to me is when you look at the data for all carnivores and when we look at people's attitudes, the number one carnivore that people want to see is always red fox, even though they're not native. They always want to see red fox, and then it goes down, and that order varies depending on the study area. But badgers, raccoons, and even skunks are ahead of coyotes. The coyote is always the lowest one in the pecking order. Nobody wants to see a coyote, and that holds across North America, which is there's a lot of human emotions and aspects that play into this. But it's very interesting to me as a researcher why that is. But we see the same thing here in Wichita. people don't really want to see coyotes. I'm biased, I like carnivores, I think they're pretty neat. So let's look at both the data sets together. Again, you'll see there were some differences in the reporting between cameras and the citizen science, but the macro patterns are holding. In the urban core for both cameras and the citizen science, we're seeing more red fox and coyotes on the periphery of town. So we've already probably had to update our website where we said that red fox are going to hang around the periphery to avoid coyotes. No, because coyotes are in town too. And so they're probably more in the urban core. So now I'm just going to spend the rest of the talk showing you some cool videos and photos that have been uploaded. Those of you that have seen red fox or are aware of them, you know that they're just cats masquerading as dogs. They're very cat-like in their behavior, and you'll see this in this video with these two foxes shadow boxing, and you can hear them. This is from the Ring doorbell. You'll see them shadow box here. Very almost cat-like with an arch and do their behavior. So we're getting really good information from this where we can not only tell the species but number of individuals, and so we're really again appreciative of the citizens of the city of Wichita. These are some photos that have been turned in of fox. I tend to know the kid that turned this in. This is outside of Wichita Northwest High School. A fox right outside the chemistry lab, right there in the middle of the day. So we're getting a lot of good photos and videos turned in. And this video, it gets a little herky-jerky for some reason when I upload it into PowerPoint, but this coyote you'll see is moving while people are driving by, and it sticks its nose into these bushes, and unfortunately the full video didn't upload. You'll see some of the video, but a hen mallard is in there sleeping in. Her technique of surprise and flushing works because then the coyote's startled, he looks around and he doesn't go in there to even investigate the nest. Let's see if I can at least get it to play. So you can see he's just going about his business. People are driving down the road and the coyote's just walking around in the middle of Wichita. So unfortunately the whole video on that one doesn't play in PowerPoint, but it's a neat video. The other thing I'll say is that in addition to the coyotes, and red fox, we're starting to get a handle on our other mesocarnivores. And in the long-term plans of this project, we want to start adding in some of these other carnivores like bobcats and those things. But one of the interesting ones are gray fox. And Bob Gross can attest to this. There's very few detections of gray fox in Wichita and Sedgwick County. He's responsible for a lot of them. But we've had 6 detections of gray fox since this project started. And gray fox are much different than red fox. They're much more arboreal, up in trees. There's some dietary overlap with red fox, but they are predators of birds a lot more than red fox tend to be. And so here's a video of a gray fox. You can see the very distinct stripe down its tail. They're one of our tree rows on the edge of town. So we're getting data on other species. And these are just some photos that people have uploaded that I like to show. If you like to golf at Sims Golf Course, you'll see coyotes apparently. This on Sims Golf Course as well. A lot of our foxes, and we're pretty sure that they're denning in these storm drains. We see them coming in and out of these storm drains a lot. And there's a lot of really cool photos and videos being submitted by citizens in the city of Wichita. We're starting to get a handle, maybe a little bit, starting to see where we're having kit and pup production. These photos I thought were really cool. There's 3 kits. There's actually mom sitting right there. The den is hopefully not under the foundation. It's not ideal to be under the concrete of the driveway, but that'd be better than in the foundation of the house. And then our squirrely coyote pups here chewing on the strap for our camera trap. That's actually on McConnell Air Force Base. So just to kind of summarize, in year 1, it's really early in the study, but coyote and fox distributions within Wichita vary greatly depending on if you were using camera trap data or citizen science data and what would be the drivers that you would use to predict. And so the models were very different, where The models based on the public sighting reports correlated the distance to roads, building density, and income of the neighborhood. This contrasted with our occupancy models from camera trapping, where canid occupancy was not correlated to any of those things except building density for coyotes. And so what we're telling ourselves and other researchers is that care should be taken to interpret results from different projects, whether you're using citizen science or camera traps, and we'll see what the GPS collar data tells us. But it's like anything in science. The data are the data. It's the lens that we look through them and the interpretation as scientists. And our job as managers and scientists is to be honest brokers of the data and information, and then we try to use that to the best of our ability to meet management objectives. Understanding that everybody out there in a lot of different publics have different objectives of what they want to see with species like coyotes and red fox. If I asked all of us out here, we'd probably see that we have different views of coyotes and red fox based on our own encounters and our history and our backgrounds. So again, we're hoping to understand the space use of these two canids in Wichita. We are evaluating citizen science as a tool because it's definitely a cost-effective way, and it's a lot less time-intensive for us as biologists than capturing and collaring animals and putting out these camera traps. And then we're trying to understand some of the impacts of management decisions on conflict levels and locations across the city. Last thing I'll point out is that we are seeing some mange in our coyotes, and so we may be able to detect ectoparasite prevalence levels through our monitoring of this project. And with that, I'll thank Julie and Erica at Utah State University. I've got a lot of people at KDWP to thank. Michaela Oding, who is our technician on this. Michaela is contemplating doing her master's thesis on the radio collaring aspect of this project. Justin Jones is who at KDWP set up our reporting website, so we're indebted to him. Matt Peak for a lot of being a sounding board. He's the statewide fur bearer biologist. Brody Latham and Nadia Margie were instrumental in advertising this both through traditional and social media. And Jeff Rue, a biologist for KDWP, is helping with captures. And of course the residents of Wichita. And I need to thank Sedgwick County, the city of Wichita, and McConnell for access. I want to thank, again, Matt Peak, Adam Ehlers, and Drew Ricketts up at K-State for letting us bounce ideas off of. I want to thank Dr. Heather Ahrens, who's the vet from the Sedgwick County Zoo, working on the captures with us. And then, of course, you all know Bob Gress, and I want to thank him for his generosity with his photos that have been very instrumental in helping us advertise this project and get it on the website and in presentations. So with that, I'll take any questions. If you're interested, that's the actual email site for the project, and then my own email if you have any questions and want to send in any photos, we'll gladly take them. But if there's any questions, I'll take those. Thank you.
How many animals have you collared?
We're just into the beginning stages of it, so just a handful. Again, we are trying to get to 15 to 20 for each of them, and maybe more of that down the line. So. Yes.
I live in a patio home addition south of 13 between Rock and Woodlawn. 3 years ago, we had them breeding in our neighborhood, and it's mostly older people that live there, and it really created an uproar. They wouldn't take their dogs out. They were hiring someone to try to get rid of them. It was really a terrible deal for them. But then when you went on the internet, you could find out more about them, and they kind of settled down. But two things happened to me. I had a compost pile, and I saw one of the foxes go into the compost pile and pull out an animal to eat. I couldn't tell exactly what it was. And another thing is, I was transplanting a shrub. I pulled an old one out, and I left the hole, and the next day I went and bought a shrub. I came back, and the hole was filled. So here I'm digging in, and here's a squirrel
Nice, well,
And now we have hardly any rabbits or squirrels, and really cleaned up the neighborhood.
Well, the good thing is the squirrels and rabbits will come back as they are prolific breeders, and, you know, and the one thing I would say, and, you know, the one thing I know in my 30-year career is never say never. So this is always, that's my caveat before I'm gonna say what I'm gonna say. Foxes are much smaller than most people realize. They are very furry, fluffy, whatever term you want to use. If you wet them down, or if you see them in the summer when they're in their summer pelage, they look really skinny, like they're almost like starving. And they only weigh a lot of times like 10 pounds. So foxes, I'm saying that because, again, never say never. The probability of a fox taking a pet, unless you have like a Chihuahua or a really small dog, is pretty small. Coyotes, that's a different story. Now that, not to say it doesn't happen, and it couldn't happen, but it's not as high a probability as if you had a coyote anyway. So that's the first thing that I would say. The other thing I would say is that, yeah, if you get any pictures of your foxes and they return, we'll gladly take them on the on the website. So. Yes.
I had a couple of questions. One is your data indicate that the total populations of either of these animals are getting larger and smaller? And also, is there any dietary overlap, or what dietary overlap is there between the two animals?
Yeah, so those are two very good questions. The first one I would say stay tuned, because the reason we started this study and we're only 1 year in is because we didn't have a handle on what our population was. And to do a population, I'm going to get really science data wonky on you here. We do what's called mark recapture analysis. It's based on the number of individuals you mark out there, and then another sampling frame when you can go back and look at how many of those you detect again. And there's a lot of different variants, and the math can get pretty complex, but that's kind of its base level. To do that, we have to mark individuals. And so, because it's, you know, for some foxes, you can tell them, for some coyotes, we may be able to get at some of this with individual pelt colorations and patterns. We don't know that for sure yet, but stay tuned. We're trying to use these different techniques to look at the population over time. We just need to get baseline. We know that historically, coyote populations in urban areas across most of North America are tending to increase. But we don't even have a baseline level in Wichita. So that's one of the things we're trying to get. In terms of dietary overlap, that's a really good question, and I'm going to give the best scientific answer I know. It depends. I know that's a non-committal fence riding answer, but it really depends on the situation that you're in, whether it's a wildland setting, an urban setting. Both of these species are generalists in terms of their habitat and also their dietary, what we call dietary breadth. They'll eat about anything. You know, obviously coyotes have a larger range of diet because they're bigger bodied animals, but both species will eat fruit and nuts and vegetation and be predators on small prey items like small mammals, rodents, that kind of stuff. Obviously, coyotes will eat foxes. Foxes may scavenge coyotes, although I don't know of any of that in the literature. But so there's a lot of diet overlap. One of the things we're going to find out with our marked individuals is what their diets are at Wichita, and that's one of our questions. Are they eating mostly trash? Are they eating mostly rodents? Are they eating rabbits? Are they eating birds? We just don't know what's going on in Wichita. So long-winded scientific answer to say it depends, and we're still figuring it out. Yes?
I saw last fall a red fox in a big drainage outlet, concrete pipe, and it runs through, the pipe dumps into a drainage. Some people call it a creek, but really it's this ditch, drainage ditch. And it sat there, and I saw it a couple of days sitting in there. And do you have any way of, when people report that? Now, a lot of people walk along this, there's a sidewalk along that you can see there. Do you have any way to sort of normalize how many people turn in seeing the same fox.
Yeah, well, you just nailed one of the hardest statistical problems with using citizen science data. We don't know that. I mean, there's some ways when we look at data, so like, I'm getting really scientific here in terms of analysis, but if you get GPS color data, there is autocorrelation spatially and temporally that you can use statistical models to disentangle that and then subsample the data so you don't have autocorrelation. There's a potential that we might be able to do that with the timing of when people are calling in. The problem is with citizen science data is, GPS data, we get it when it's collected. Citizen science, they may see it 3 days ago and then turn in, but as long as we get enough information of date and time, we can then try to look at that autocorrelation and look at what the probability is that we're seeing the same individual over and over again. Because that definitely happens in the citizen science data. So we can account for that. We haven't gotten that far in the day. We're just, we're literally 14 months into the data collection, and so we're pretty much looking at that as we go along, but yes, we can.
Can you talk a little bit about how far along you are with the GPS collars and how you do that?
How we do that, yeah, so once we catch an animal, then we chemically immobilize it, and then we put the GPS collar on it. It's just like basically a dog collar, and then those collars are set to, there's a breakaway mechanism that will time and drop that. We get real-time data, but the way the collars work to keep the battery life longer, some of the data are stored on board. So it's not having to use battery to link up to the satellite, and then when we recover the collar off the break after the animal, it either releases, or if an animal dies, then we can get more of the data.
And how many do you have out right now?
We don't have very many out, we just have a couple. Because we're just starting that aspect of it, and part of it is when we were gearing up and we got the collars and we were ready to go, it's fall time now, and we've made it a concerted effort. We're gonna really focus on trapping after the fall, because we don't wanna put a bunch of collars on dispersing animals. Because we're concerned if we catch dispersers now, our study area goes from Wichita to, 5 counties. So, especially if we get coyotes, we don't want a coyote that we radio collar and that spends 90% of its time over in Butler County. We may end up with that, and that's fine, the data will be what they are, but we have made a concerted effort in this first year to wait till this winter, and we'll start focusing more on the collaring efforts.
I put about 1,000 miles a month in the metro. Are roadkills of any interest to you? Because I see a lot.
Yeah,
Foxes especially.
Yeah, as long as that's noted, and there is a place to on the reporting site note whether it was alive or an animal that was dead. As long as that's noted in there, that helps us disentangle that. So yeah, we'll definitely take roadkill data.
I'm going to step out for a second, so I'm sorry if this is a redundant question, but how relevant is unnaturalist data for what you're doing? Because so many of the issues you talked about with reporting and timing of the report based on the size, they automatically pull that info from the photo to auto-populate stuff and try to solve that when post if they can. And it comes up as research rate. Is it actually a valid research rate in your opinion that you would deem as
Yeah, so I guess I'm trying to think how to answer that. From my perspective, citizen science data are very valuable, and as wildlife ecologists, whether you're studying birds or mammals or whatever, we can glean a lot of information from citizen science. It's like any model you run. The model's only as good as the data that's going in. You've probably heard it if you're a scientist, bad stuff in, bad stuff out. So as long as you have quality control on your data going in, and as an ecologist, I was raised by an engineer. My dad and I probably disagree on what quality data are, because he's in a much more, they have a lot more control in a lab setting when you're an aeronautical engineer and trying to determine drag or lift or whatever than we do with our study animals. So data quality is all relative. We do the best that we can, and we censor the data that we don't have enough information to make, what we would consider quality. And I don't care what scientist you are, if you're in you know, there's some art to this and subjectivity because we're humans and we all bring our biases, you know, even if you're working in the hard sciences of physics or whatever, but we have to be a lot more understanding that we have a lot more confounding factors in our models as wildlife ecologists. I don't know if that's a good answer or what you're looking for, but the data models are only as good as the data going in and out.
Jon, I know this group has a lot of natural curiosity about different aspects of natural history, and we're always looking for new programs and more information. What sort of teaser tidbits are you willing to offer on black bear status in Kansas?
Black bear status in Kansas. We are dealing with them more and more as a management issue in Kansas. They are historical species in the state of Kansas. And with 8,000 of them knocking on our door in Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, it's a matter of when, not if. Yeah.
What's year 2 look like as far as the camera placements? Are you doing the same time frame? Are you doing the same locations?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think for the second year, we're going to keep that so we have multiple years. I think over time, as we get potentially more funding and move along to address, once we feel like we've addressed certain questions, we may start to shift some of the distribution of the cameras on the landscape and fill in some of these holes, basically like an infill project. You heard me mention that right now we have them at a 3-kilometer basically spacing. That probably is lowering our probability of detection of red fox. And so we might kind of do some optimization modeling to figure out what the optimal distance of those between the cameras is for maximizing detection. So people that are doing similar studies somewhere else don't have to reinvent the wheel. So
kind of piggybacking off that, how impactful do you feel the surveys that Brand is on detection of UVC data across the study?
yeah, that's the $1 million question in wildlife research is, is your study design accurately reflecting what's going on out there on the landscape? What we did is we used a series of urban fox studies that are going on. There's a whole network, urban wildlife network out there that uses camera traps to generate data. So we wanted to make sure that our data were comparable to those other studies. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. Some of these study design issues have been worked out in other systems with all the probabilistic modeling scenarios for the occupancy modeling. So we went with that to make sure that we were comparable to other studies. That doesn't mean we couldn't improve on it, but yeah, all of those factors influence occupancy models and things that you have to take into account for. And you sound like you know something about statistics, and obviously there's a lot of noise out there in ecological systems. And what you're trying to do is figure out what are the best predictors to account for that noise and that variance that's out there. And so we're not going to capture everything. And one of the things I think probably more so than anything in my 30 years of doing this type of stuff is that individual variation of animals is really important, but yet it's really hard to account for. You can add in an individual as a factor in your models, and that really all of a sudden starts explaining everything. So, there's a lot of different anthropomorphizing here a little bit. A lot of different personalities and wild animals out there that have a lot of impact on how they perceive humans and our activities on the landscape. And that can really impact their detection probabilities, their movements, their shyness, boldness level, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's constantly things we're thinking about. Follow the question? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't see Brad. Yeah.
What are your costs look like? What are the costs on your cameras and your timber?
Costs? So a camera setup with the actual camera that we're using, with the lock box, and then with the lock on them, each setup is probably about $150. Now, the cost for the citizen science is minuscule. The cost for capturing animals and putting radio collar on A radio collar's, you know, several $1,000s. So when I first started, when I was working on bears, when GPS collars first came out, they were 20 grand a piece. They've come down, bear collars now are like 1,500 a piece. So our collars, our GPS collars are, I think they're 1,500, 1,600 a piece. I don't remember the exact. It's not cheap, but you know, we're wildlife researchers. We run on a shoestring budget often.
You running a camera trap here in the park?
What's that?
You running a camera trap here in the park?
Yep. Yes, we do have one here. If you've seen it, then yep, it is here in this park. Yes.
How about curiosity question with this crowd? Ask their responses, what they feel if they saw a fox or a coyote.
Oh, so
Ask the audience.
you want me to ask? I gotta go back and look. I gotta look at our. I have to look at our. I'll go with the. Okay, so let's. We'll do foxes first. Okay, how many of you would feel happy if you saw a fox? Okay, look around. How many would feel lucky? Okay. How many would be scared? No shame in any of these answers. How many would be worried? Might be context dependent. Okay. How many would be indifferent? Okay. How many would be angry? Right. And then other. I probably can't ask that one, but all right. Now let's see our. Okay, coyotes. How many are happy if you see a coyote? Okay, we are definitely at a tail end of distribution in this audience, which does not surprise me in the least. How many would feel lucky? Similar, maybe a few less. How many scared? Okay. How many worried? Okay, a few more of those than foxes. How many would be indifferent? Okay. So we're at the tail end of the distribution of the normal human population in Wichita, Kansas, probably in this audience, which is not surprising. Yes?
I'm curious, if you guys do like any sort of, like, get survey participants to elaborate on what other, you know, emotion they're experiencing, when, I want to know what the other category is.
Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and look, but that's basically a box. That's basically a box where they can write in. A lot of these are kind of multiple choices, but they're designed by human dimensions people that we talk to. There's multiple choices, but then there's always kind of none of these really fit what I want to say, so there's always this other category where then you can fill in the box. So, you know, if somebody wanted to go through that, again, I'm not a human dimensions researcher. I've done a lot of work with human dimension ecologists, particularly people in the National Park Service on some of the different, when you work on large carnivores, a lot of times in my past, I'm not always the most popular person walking into the room. You know, you work on grizzly bears in the Northern Rockies, you have a different perspective. You work on wolves, you know, those kind of things, you get a different response than some of the constituents in the room. Yeah.
Is there any kind of outreach based upon this little survey you talked about, to perhaps educate the public that maybe it's okay to feel happy or lucky if you see a coyote rather than worried or scared? Is there any sort of, you talked earlier about urbanization and the traditional views of how we see those animals within our urban areas. Do you guys have anything out there that you know, flyers or anything that, you know, they look like you and kill a few dogs?
Well, we do have educational materials. We haven't made a concerted effort tied to this project per se, but Charlie Coate, the wildlife biologist here that covers Wichita and Sedgwick County, has a lot of information, educational materials that if somebody reaches out specifically about coyotes or red fox, Charlie's really good at his job in terms of spending the extra time and trying to educate members of the public. I mean, if you know anything about it, if you've ever met Charlie, you can get in a 20 to 40 minute conversation with him, and he'll definitely have that conversation with you to educate the public. He goes above and beyond, so he definitely does that, but we haven't done it per se. Now, you know, we have the nature center here, and we can definitely take advantage of that, and there's maybe some plans to do that, but we haven't done that yet.
And I was just gonna point out, that's part of the challenge of what Wichita is trying to do with Chaplin Nature Center and what we try to do at Great Plains Nature Center, and that taking information, adapting it to the public, to change the public perception on nature and wildlife and birds and reptiles and what, that's what facilities like this are for. But facilities like this need information from people like Jon.
Yeah, and it's definitely a symbiotic relationship, you know. I try to present some of this data, you know, you can only distill it so far, but, you know, using the experts that are in our education side of wildlife ecology, you know, they go hand in hand, and they can help us as scientists and managers get that information out. Yes.
Since there's so many coyotes in Wichita, how come I don't hear them howling every evening?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. If I had to take a hypothesis-based approach, they may be doing behavioral modification that minimizes their detection. Now, you know, that's a hypothesis at this point.
You started doing some preliminary local data. Have you compared that data to the other locations that have done similar studies yet?
We have not yet. We've got to get a large enough data set to feel comfortable and kind of get our feet underneath us with our entire data set, but that is in the works in a plan, you know, what we call meta-analyses to do cross-study comparisons so we can learn as much as we can from each other. But yeah, plan to do that, we just haven't got there again, so we're leading the study.
Sorry to kind of jump back to the question about educational programming and knowledge and stuff. I'm the educator at Chaplin Nature Center. I just wanted to say, if any of you guys are wanting that kind of programming too, I'm here as a resource and work for you guys. So if you guys are interested in a certain kind of programming centered around urban wildlife viewing and, you know, breaking down the what's the word? People tend to be afraid of what they don't understand, and educational programming is a long way towards fostering an appreciation and, you know, desire for conservation efforts and stuff. And if you guys want to learn more and have programs about that,
Sounds good, yeah, we can definitely make a connection, exchange phone numbers and stuff after the presentation, because we're always up for engaging the educational side of wildlife conservation and management. Yes?
So in these systems where you're seeing these species kind of be drawn to those more urban or peri-urban areas, leaving kind of habitat behind unoccupied, is there an increase in total number of species, or increase in total, I guess both, right? Species number.
Yeah, that's a really good question, a really complex answer. So I'm gonna revert back to my 25 years of studying urban interface bears for this answer, because I don't know for this study, but one of the things that we saw with bears, these species that are kind of more generalist, they tend to be more adaptable to living in the presence of humans. And so they take advantage of those resources, and so they form these these beneficial relationships. And what we saw with bears in a lot of systems is anthropogenic food resources can be so beneficial to them from the physiological perspective, because they're predictable in space and time, and they have a really high caloric value, that bears would move and shift down into these urban areas, especially in bad natural food production years, that they would take advantage of it. And so we would have these augmented densities and augmented, a lot of times, increasing the number of cubs produced, and a lower age of first reproduction of females. The problem is that when wildlife often they're in urban areas, their mortality rates are so high it offsets that. So they never realize that putative gain in what we would call fitness. You know, they might give birth to more cubs, but the cubs are hit by cars at such a high frequency they never really enter the population. So we have to do things that reduce that conflict or that mortality rate. My suspicion is we see a similar thing with this. Coyotes and red fox takes advantage of it. We probably have more red fox on the landscape because they're taking advantage of these urban areas than we would in the absence of urban areas. But I just don't know that to say that conclusively. And so when animals are pulled back kind of down these urban areas and out of these backcountry areas, it depends on the species and the situation and the setting, whether those vacated home ranges get filled in behind them or not. Often they do, but it's not always a given.
This is a different kind of question, but when I first came to Kansas, I never heard about coyotes being here. Are they a relatively new animal coming here in the last 75 years or so?
No, you're talking Kansas in general?
Wichita area.
Yeah, Wichita, I don't know the history as well as I probably should in terms of when coyotes first started showing up in town. I'm sure we had them historically, you know, on the fringes and showing up, but there's not just really a lot of good data. Coyotes are native to Kansas, and they've always been here, but coyotes taking advantage of urban areas as a phenomenon across the United States is increasing. So there's probably an increase in Wichita, but I don't know that we have, one of the reasons we're doing this study is we just don't have that baseline data.
Well, I know when I first came here, we drive around and I never saw any coyotes. Then over the years, you see more and more and more now.
Right, and those kind of data points, you know, and observations, those anecdotal observations, you're probably seeing the right pattern. I just don't know the time frame that happened over.
I think we're seeing deer and turkey in town too. Maybe that's an attractive thing.
Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. To get me started on turkeys, one of the things where we're actually, our turkey population is really struggling. And where we're actually seeing poult production right now tends to be in our urban areas. And so there's something going on between our rural and our urban areas, but that's a whole nother conversation around turkeys. But yes, turkeys are doing okay in Wichita relative, it seems like, anecdotally compared to some other areas where our turkey population is really struggling.
Well, I'm wondering if the amount of coyotes moving in could correlate with the number of geese that have come in over the last 40 years. Because I remember we didn't used to have Canada geese.
Yeah.
And in the last 40 years, I mean, now we have an unbelievable number.
Yeah, and so in 1980, if you go back to 1980, only 6 counties in Kansas had Canada geese. The agency, my agency, started reintroducing geese, including here in Wichita in around 1980, and they brought in 10,000 geese. I think if I remember right, I might have these numbers flipped, but I think it was 6,000 adults and 4,000 gazelles. Geese have now become common enough that it's a management issue big time for Charlie and myself. Our resident population peaked in about 2010, and because of management activities, it's gone back down. Charlie's really working, but because geese are federally managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we can only manage the resident population, which the Fish and Wildlife Service defines as geese that are here from March 15th to August 31st. When you see most of the geese is during the migration in the winter, and our winter flock skyrockets. At some point, Alan and Charlie were counting, Alan Macaron at Friends University and Charlie Cove, they were counting 17 to 20,000 geese in the winter. But as a state agency, we cannot do anything to manage those geese at that period. They fall under federal jurisdiction because they're a migratory species. So, complex answer, but our resident population is actually back down to about 2002 and 2003 levels because of management actions, but migratory population continues to increase in the city.